Estados Unidos ha asegurado
The United
control
States has
territorial
assured
logística efectiva
territorial
para sus
control, effective
intervenciones,
logistics for
operatividad
its
y capacidad de
interventions,
espionaje
operations, and
en el orden.
spionage
Entre otras
capacity.
cosas, con una
Among
amplísima
other
red de
things,
bases
with a
militares
broad
que
network
cubre
of
la
military
totalidad de
bases that
continentes,
covers
océanos
all
y
the
espacio ultramarino.
continents,
Y es que la
oceans,
geografía
and
mundial es vista
space.
como un territorio que debe ser por él
World
ocupado y
geography is
explotado.
seen
Y
as
en esa
something that
visión
should be
hegemónica y de
exploited and
unipolaridad,
occupied by
los
it.
enclaves
And in
militares
this
son un eslabón
unipolar
esencial.
vision,
No en vano, para
military
llevar a cabo sus
sets are
estrategias de guerra,
essential
segmenta
to
al mundo en
carry
unidades de
out
combate
its
y de mando.
military
Ahora
strategies
bien,
that
en
divides
tiempos
the
en los
world.
cuales se consolidan
In
otros
times
polos
where
de poder
other
y hay
poles of
lugares
power
geoestratégicos en
are
los que el poderío
consolidated
militar
and other
estadounidense ha
geostrategic
salido
places where
desgastado a lo
U.S.
interno,
military power has been
necesariamente debe
wasted,
venir un rediseño del
necessarily
mapa
there should
estratégico
be a
global.
redesign of the
Rusia y
global
China ganan
strategic
cada
map.
vez más
Russia
espacio en el
and
tablero
China are
geopolítico.
gaining a
Estados Unidos
geopolitical
activa
space.
estrategias de
The United
contención.
States
¿Qué tan
activates
efectivas? ¿Qué
containment
movimientos
strategies.
telúricos podría
How
generar esa
effective
agenda
are
de
they? What
contención de la Rusia
movements could
revitalizada
this
después de la extinción de la
agenda
URSS y del
generate
gigante asiático
after the
que teje
expansion
alianzas
of
al tiempo que
Russia
inunda el
and
mundo con múltiples
China
proyectos de la
that
más avanzada
floods the
ingeniería
worlds with
e
the highest
infraestructura? Estados
state-of-the-art
Unidos padece una
engineering projects?
especie de adicción
The United
incurable al
States
uso de la
seems to
fuerza
have
militar.
an
Los
uncurable
presupuestos de guerra acaso no son una ofensa
disease of the
a quienes
use
no
of
tienen ni para
military
comer y luchan
power
por la sobrevivencia
in
de la especie
detriment to
humana.
those who have
Bases
nothing to
militares
eat.
estadounidenses fuertes en
U.S.
labores de guerra
military
es nuestra jugada
bases
crítica de hoy.
is
Desplegados
our
al
critical
tablero,
move today.
comenzamos a mirar actores y acontecimientos importantes. Acompáñanos. Dos cosas noticiosas que destacar
Two
en esta
news
nuestra primera portada.
must be
Punto
emphasized
número uno,
today.
la semana
One,
pasada varios medios
last week, several
divulgaban que el jefe
means
de división aeroespacial de la Guardia Revolucionaria
the
de la
Revolutionary
República
Guard
Islámica
of
de
the
Irán
Islamic Republic
declaró
of
que las bases
Iran
militares
declared
de Estados
that
Unidos,
U.S. military
específicamente las que
bases,
están asentadas
namely
en
those
Afganistán,
settled on
Emiratos Árabes Unidos y
Afghanistan,
Qatar,
United
así como
Arab
su
Emirates,
flota de
and
guerra
Qatar, as
operativa
well
en el
as
Golfo Pérsico,
operative
están en el
fleets,
rango o espectro
are
de
in the
misiles iraníes que son
spectrum
cada vez más
spectrum of
precisos y
Iranian
modernizados.
missiles that are
Esto en
increasingly
momentos de
precise
fuertes
and
tensiones entre
modernized.
Estados Unidos e Irán,
This
como
in the
se
midst
sabe, por
of
las sanciones
strong
del primero
tension
impuesto al
between
segundo
the United
y por el
States
retiro
and Iran
de
because of the
Estados Unidos del
sanctions
pacto
of the
nuclear
first
logrado en
and
2015.
the U.S.
Otro
withdrawal
tópico
from
es la
the
propuesta de Europa de
nuclear
crear su
agreement.
propio
The
ejército
other topic
unificado,
is
algo que tiene el acuerdo
Europe's
del
proposal to create
presidente
a
francés Emmanuel
unified
Macron y la canciller federal alemana
budget
Angela Merkel,
proposed
pero que
by
evidentemente
Macron
no ha agradado
and
al mandatario
Merkel
estadounidense
that
Donald Trump, quien ha sido
Donald Trump
amenazante
did
y
not
les ha
like
dicho varias veces
and
a
has
los socios
threatened many
europeos
times his
tienen sí o sí que
European
contribuir más
partners
a la OTAN, el
with
presupuesto de guerra de esta
contributing
organización
with
aliada.
NATO's war budget. Don't play with the tail of the line. It would only make you regret. You will regret it. You can't threaten the Iranian nation with your interests. We know your interests and make sacrifices to keep them. You cannot urge the Iranian people to attempt against Iranian security. You are wrong. You have shown your adversity against Iranian people. You know that a war would mean the destruction of all their capacities. They will start a war, but we would end it. Therefore, they shouldn't insult the Iranian people, and we shouldn't insult our president. They know our power in the region, our potential in asymmetric wars.
Agencia Informativa Latinoamericana Prensa Latina.
Prensa Latina agency says strong world claim against foreign military bases, with delegations of Latin America, Europe, Asia, and Africa. On November 18th, the first international conference against U.S. NATO military bases was held to demand the 1,000 military bases that both the United States and NATO have in the world, and to ask for peaceful coexistence. This is the first effort of the recently established Campaign for Peace, created with many environmental organizations and social movements. In Cuba, the 6th International Peace Seminar will take place in May in Cuba, organized by the Cuban Movement for Peace and Sovereignty for the Peoples. Our recommendation can be found in Misión Verdad Venezuelan webpage called The Three Fronts in the New Global Strategy War of the Pentagon. the Pentagon has decided to propose a new strategy to try to contain the Russian and Chinese powers that are rising and have increased influence in critical matters. Michael Clare assures that this is translated in a new long war, no longer against terrorism, but against three Euro-Asian powers. The confrontation against China goes from the Korean Republic to the waters of the Southern Sea and Indian Sea with the support of U.S. allies, that is South Korea, Japan, and Australia. The second front, Europe, the confrontation with the Russian Federation goes from Scandinavia, the southern republics of the Baltic, to Romania, the Black Sea, and the Caucasus in the east, where the members of NATO are key, and the Middle East, the third front, with a growing influence of Russia in favor of Iran, Syria, Iraq, and other non-state actors called the Axis of Resistance against the U.S. influx with Israel as its main ally. To quantify the military presence of the United States in the world in terms of troops and bases is not an easy task because official data sometimes are inconsistent and incomplete. Even so, it is clear that Washington's military expansion reaches increasingly higher levels. At the beginning, we gave some numbers. We said, we talked about 800 military bases, 1,000 between NATO and the United States. Nevertheless, this doesn't include the secret military bases. We're going to talk about this with our correspondent, Isaba Garcia, from Mexico City. Yes, let's talk about U.S. military bases. Today, there is no state in the world that does not have the war potential of the United States and much less the capacity of activating as soon as it wants. This is due to the military bases network Washington has around the world. There allegedly are 800 military bases around the 50 states of the U.S. territory. Of course, this doesn't count the secret bases as it is believed exist in Israel and Saudi Arabia, its main allies. Studies say that it's very difficult to say how many bases there are because of the magnitude of this country's deployment in the country. It is calculated that 342 of these 800 are in Europe, 100 in Germany, and others in Latin America, 2 in Panama, 2 in Puerto Rico, 9 in Colombia, and 1 in Peru. An important part is concentrated in Central America and the Caribbean. Last March, the Southern Command justified its military presence in the United States and published a report that talks about the main threats and the way of confronting them, including Cuba, Venezuela, Bolivia, and also the struggle against drug traffic, and main presence of China, Russia, and Iran in Latin America and the Caribbean. As we said in this program, what we see is that the United States conceives world land surface as a broad battlefield. But in what countries of our region the bases are key for the United States? Firstly, of course, Colombia, especially because of its new relation with NATO. In 2017, Colombia invested 3.7% in military expense, the highest in the region. Installing U.S. bases in Neuquén, Argentina, is after the finding of a mega oil reserve, which seems consistent. The same happened in Peru. That became a key piece of U.S. military deployment in the region, with the installation of bases in the Peruvian jungle and emergency operative centers. We closed this report with Mexico, where military expense have increased considerably in the last 10 years, with 47.5%, $6 billion, which represent 2.5% of the GDP. Unfortunately, why they did this, important items like technology, education, and health went down.
Interesante, Isa. Hasta la próxima. Hoy con un poderío
how interesting, with a wasted and questioned economic power, U.S. hegemony is supported through its powerful military complex. It's good to ask this question: if the only way of interrelating with other actors is through military force, is it repeating mistakes committed in bipolar times? We leave this in our geopolitical board. We'll be back after the pause with our guests. U.S. military bases, strong war links is the question and hypothesis we are going to ask our analysts. Right now we're going to Sputnik, a Russian agency that says that asks why the United States want to control the military base of Alcântara in Brazil. This is the Brazilian Airspace Agency. Some months ago, in August, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, James Mattis, chose Brazil as the first destination of his tour around South America. It's the only rocket launching structure in the region, together with Kourou in the French Guiana, important for European Space Agency. Both are located around the equator line, which is useful for the launchings and saving fuel. Therefore, Trump's interest in cooperating with this country and the participation the United States had in the extreme right electoral campaign, where last October 28, Bolsonaro won in second round. Let's go to defining military bases, how they are classified according to functions and nature, and how many the United States have. Aisa Garcia gave us some numbers we want to retake in our map today. Training bases, command and centers and storage area for military equipment. This is how military bases are defined. Spaces provided for lodging one or more units. Their operations depend on foreign aid. They operate in secret and restricted access to the public. According to their function, they are 4 blocks: Air Force, Army, Navy, and communication and monitoring bases, SPY. The military bases are spread in a command grid, divided into 5 regional units and 4 special units. Ground area considered part of the greater battlefield. Each command is under 1 general. It has more than 200,000 U.S. military deployed that could be patrolled or controlled constantly from these bases. Currently, the United States and NATO has more than 800 military bases around the world, of which 76 have been provided by the Southern Command in Latin America and the Caribbean, 12 in Panama, 12 in Puerto Rico, 9 in Colombia, 8 in Peru, 2 in Paraguay, 3 in Honduras, 3 in Mexico, and 1 in the Guantanamo Bay, which sovereignty was taken away from Cuba by the end of last century. From Asia to Europe and Greenland. This vast network of military bases has been woven by the United States with more than 200,000 soldiers distributed in 80 countries and many forces. Most U.S. bases were built after the Second World War. First, to contain the USSR and its influence zone during the Cold War, and one after the Berlin Wall fell to allegedly fight against terrorism that was allegedly created by the United States as a casus belli. Another excuse, particularly used to operate bases in our region, has been the combat to drug traffic in countries like Colombia, Mexico, and Central American nations. The death toll and disappearance toll confirm the hypothesis that such combat is inexistent. The truth is that the bases that damage the environment around Europe, Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean have allowed the world's patrols to have places of training for its troops, guarantee having weapons, and control the hegemony of the empire. Especially, they have been essential to confiscate energy resources and raw material. The occupation of corporations also plays its part. The United States has invaded the world and deems the land as a battlefield that it has one by one. This shows expansionism, but also makes its relations with the rest of the countries be exclusively in terms of military imposition, which is extremely costly from all points of view. The United States depends on the use of its military forces to reach its goals in foreign policy matters. It's also the world's main weapons exporter. And decades ago, it guaranteed through the School of the Americas and training foreign armies, coups against leftist governments, torture to any opponents. The question is, what would the United States will do in times of multipolarity, where powers like Russia and China have reached superior technological progress? We will answer questions from Bilbao, Iñaki Orrestarazo, international analyst, and from San Juan, Puerto Rico, Darko Layosazdi, specialist in security matters, energy, defense, military defense, and international relations. Welcome both for being with us. I will start with Dr. Layosazdi and ask him if today U.S. hegemony almost exclusively depends on the military power it has procured in the last century and these decades. Welcome, Professor. Good afternoon. Thank you for your invitation. I think that the U.S. military power that, as we know, has the world's largest military budget, it says that in 2013, the Pentagon had said that it had 5,000 military bases, of which around 600 were abroad, outside the United States. The other sources talk about 750 and 800 U.S. bases of different sizes distributed around the world, besides those of the continental U.S. The military power is important not only because of the presence of the bases and the agreements with the countries where those bases are located. This also means close security bonds, which also means U.S. weapons exports for the countries that can receive them, and due to their high technology and cost, the United States gives credit. In general, the countries where their bases are, they also ask for their weapons. But I wouldn't say this is the only factor. The diplomatic, economic weight, bilateral agreements, but multilateral agreements like the FTAs to open those allied countries where there are bases, or others that do not not have important bases, to open them to the U.S. market. And here comes sanctions, as we know very well. Sanctions against Venezuela, Russia, Syria, against Iran, North Korea, etc. This is a way of pressing in economic topics. And as we've seen with Iran, the European Union have said that it wants to preserve the nuclear agreement with Iran, where UK, France, Germany have executed, besides the United States that left, and including China and Russia as well. But I have the sense that Europe can't prevent its companies from trading from Iran because of sanctions of the United States. Here we see an important punishment by the United States. The imperial territories are also Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and the so-called associated states like the Marshall Islands or Micronesia Federation, both in the Pacific Ocean. And on the other hand, the invisible empire based on economic influence and technology, Internet, for example, Google, Yahoo, Twitter, and the diplomatic influence as well. So this is a portfolio of influence that the United States has, where the military element is undoubtedly very important, although it's not the only one. I would like to ask our other guest, Iñaki Araztarazu from Bilbao. Some analysts say that U.S. economic power is there. Nobody doubts it. But it's true that it has lost weight with other actors that are seeking alternative structure. Is the same thing happening with the military or the country? With the military, this is also happening with the military. The military potential of the United States is huge. As my peer said very well, it has 800 bases, military bases or more around the world. And with them, it tries to control the world's resources, markets, countries. It tries to control trade transportation and hydrocarbon transportation in general, transportation zones, the straits, the seas, oceans, space, etc. In the Syrian war, we saw clearly the limitations that the United States has in the military field. Russia has given a clear demonstration that, at least in conventional weapons, it is exceeding the United States in many aspects, which was a great surprise for the United States, and is making it think that it is also losing in this field the absolute hegemony it had before. Regarding missiles and other aspects, there are also capacities. Hypersonic missiles that Russia has at this time have a capacity that exceeds the anti-missile shield that was created to enclose Russia, and especially with its missiles, it has a capacity of overcoming anti-missile shields. One of the matters that is being discussed just when the United States is losing this military advantage, in a relative way at least, they are proposing to restructure the mid-scope missiles. This is one of the main litigations at this time, and that, they say, are based on saying that Russia has not met the agreements that I think Gorbachev signed, when actually Putin said that this is not true, and that those who broke the agreements were the United States by creating these anti-missile shields that started by Poland and want to continue by Bulgaria, etc. And that they should sit down and negotiate restructuring these intermediate scope missiles. But it seems they don't want to do it because it is there where it seems They want to recover in the short term the loss of offensive capacity of the United States and to apply and establish mid-scope missiles, a new generation in Europe, around China, and around Russia, etc., in order to create a new military barrier that would be very dangerous. The Russians are constantly warning that this situation of abandoning the agreements of mid-scope missiles would be very dangerous, and that they have to reach a series of agreements once again. And regarding materials like submarines, boats, war instruments, Russia has proved, for example, in Syria, in a clear way that it has a very important capacity. So the United States at this level are also losing hegemony relatively, and China is also increasing with carriers, missiles, planes, etc. In the economic field, as what my peer said, it is also losing hegemony because China is so big, or as big as the United States, and will exceed in a short time. And we can't say Russia is an economic power because its GDP is small in relation to the other powers. Russia's power especially is raw material, hydrocarbons, etc., and its military power. But China's power is very important, and it's creating a series of huge structures. The route of the Silk through many ways, marine, land, and is making huge investments that only in Asia, Southeast Asia, Europe, and Africa is a matter of concern. Even it is also entering in Latin America with the Canal of Nicaragua they want to build that would make the competition to the Panama Canal, and has been one of the main reasons for the revolts provoked in Nicaragua. So there are important elements that make us see clearly that U.S. hegemony is in danger in some way, which is very good because it makes us have a new world order with many powers and where nobody's completely hegemonic and agreements must be made, and with mutual respect, and at least that nobody has the hands free to do whatever they want. What telluric movements, I want to ask Professor Lajos, what consequences would an advance of the agenda to contain Russian and Chinese power take place? One stronger than the other in certain aspects, as Iñaki was telling us. Especially with the crisis of Ukraine, members of NATO, we could say that there are territorial disputes between the U.S. Navy and China in the Southern Sea, Chinese Southern Sea. And it seems that Trump's National Security Council, John Bolton, Belicist, has said that the real reason to leave the nuclear weapon mid and short scope agreement is the fact that since China has not been subject to this treaty signed in 1987 between the Soviet Union and the United States, China can build missiles outside the authorized categories and with scopes from 500 to 5,000 kilometers. This treaty does not include them from air or from the sea, and that this could be a reason for the United States to leave the treaty. And here comes a potential arms race with China, because China, we know very well that China and North Korea builds these missiles. The United States deploys these missiles in Japan, in Taiwan, against China. So the Chinese that have enough missiles will respond and probably manufacture more. There's this competition between the United States and China for different reasons, not only the commercial part, but also strategy in the South Pacific. Perhaps the existing bases could be strengthened, or rather new are open, including the Philippines, since it also has dispute points with China regarding the southern China with the Palawan Islands that Philippines is claiming. In any case, we must consider that a large concentration of bases that the United States has in two important countries that are allies, Germany and Japan, is largely due because of the defeat of both in the Second World War. And as you well said, many bases were established by the U.S. after the Second World War. I've heard Germany has 34 bases and Japan has 76, including the Navy, the War Marines, the Air Force, the Army Air Force, and there should be a change. For example, Germany and Japan decides to spend more on their defense. It's very comfortable for them not to spend in defense because the United States says it will defend them from China or North Korea. And, of course, because of the work of General MacArthur after the defeat in Japan in 1945, this is changing now because Washington wants Japan to have a more significant role of projecting its force outside its islands. But this would mean the same more defense expense by Japan. But the United States will not withdraw from its bases because Japan feels it's more comfortable to say the United States will defend it. And of course, Washington doesn't want Japan to have a powerful air fleet that could also create a naval competition, even if both are U.S. allies. And of course, Germany, with the crisis and tensions between NATO and Russia, even if Germany is an important client of natural gas and oil from Russia, an exporter of Russian machinery, there are other tensions. Besides the second Cold War between Russia and the United States, I would like to add that this could increase the war initiative because of topics like Ukraine and the rivalry between the United States and Russia because of Syria. Russia is an ally of Syria, but Washington and Israel has more than 20 illegal bases, and there we have new bases of Washington and Syria because they want to defeat the Syrian government. But besides this Cold War that could accelerate because of Washington's leaving the nuclear treaty, this could mean deployment of more U.S. missiles in Europe. There's still yet to see if Europe accepts them because they are more than like satellites, and they not dare to oppose their giant ally. Besides the military aspect, we must also talk about intelligence, spionage, because of Edward Snowden's statements, exile in Russia, and the so-called Five Sisters, the Five Eyes, not Five Sisters, Five Eyes, I'm sorry, which are all the Anglo-Saxon powers that since the Second World War have been intercepting collaborations initially of Hitler's Germany, then USSR, and after that it's United States, Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand, and Israel as well. So this network of espionage facilities must be added to the military facilities working together. And through espionage, as you well know, because of Snowden's declarations, they spied on Angela Merkel, Dilma Rousseff, and they have great advantage because as the United States invented Internet, they have a technological advantage, which will help them influence the world, even to blackmail leaders that they know of whom they know compromising aspects. I am speculating here, but this is a tool they can use in intelligence. And another thing, this is more science fiction, but since the United States inaugurated Space Forces, perhaps in 30 years we could see U.S. space bases besides they have on Earth. Precisely through technological race, try to exceed military advantages that Russia and China are achieving, as our peer said, through technology. So we have a long time to go still. Thank you, our both guests from Bilbao and San Juan de Puerto Rico, both analysts and experts in these matters that we just saw. We must ask ourselves for the next segment in what is the role of NATO in U.S. war strategy since the Soviet Union disappeared. What justifies its existence after that, and what are Europe's interests that it has shown has divided positions in essential matters? We will analyze this with our guest after the last pause. Another example of military power with interfering expansionist power with preservation of U.S. global governance is NATO. This is a military intergovernmental alliance based on the Washington Treaty, executed in April 1949, to become an instrument of war against USSR and Eastern Europe that after the Second World War chose the socialist way. Let's see some traces of NATO. Founded 60 years ago in Europe, the North American Treaty Organization, as war instrument of the United States, it has armed and reconfigured in such way after the disappearance of the USSR that's a true war machinery. Its budget, calculated in 2017, is 260 trillions, with the ministries of war, defense of the member states, controlled by the War Committee, according to its General Secretary James Stoltenberg. The United States is the main contributor with 3.57% of its GDP. Therefore, the pressure of Trump for the other members to contribute with 4% of the GDP in the mid-November, and Stoltenberg declared that the most important contributions had been made since those declarations. The United States and its allies started making its operations out of zone. And the first invasions out of the zone were the naval blockade in the Adriatic Sea in 1993 to strengthen the weapons embargo to the old Yugoslavia weapons, and to consolidate it zone in Bosnia and Herzegovina that was not authorized by the United Nations, and therefore it was internationally illegal. And the conflict in Ukraine in 2014 was also an opportunity to for this confrontation against Putin, with over-dimensioned armies, excessive military expenditures, weapons trade, and all the negative consequences in economic and social aspects in Europe and the rest of the planet. We now have Felix Roque in our study, Venezuelan analyst. Thank you for being here. I start by asking, why does NATO still exist? Well, as you informed, NATO was founded in 1949 after the Second World War, basically to confront the so-called phantom of communism of the USSR. With the fall of the Berlin Wall, you could ask ourselves what justifies the existence of NATO after the USSR disappeared. But Russia didn't disappear, and it is now one of the great powers in the planet, and therefore a danger for the United States and a hegemonic power. This is why NATO is still effective and has imperial allies around Europe and the United States. I want to ask you, regarding one of our analysts' answers, is there any possibility of the hundreds of military bases of the United States be strengthened and even more be created? Before we start this, there are some people who question the strength of those bases or military infrastructure. In October, Russia Today made a study, published a study quoted by the National Interest that says cruise missiles, hydrants would be enough to devastate the U.S. military bases and offshore bases, while the U.S. political and military command has been concerned of North Korea's ballistic missiles hit its bases. China and Russia are creating more weapons that endanger U.S. bases. Well, I think that the United States learned a lot after the Second World War, and in their aim to be a sectional power, which explains its existence, ideological existence, they are defined as a borderless country. Therefore, without any doubt, we must say that the United States proposed to colonize the planet. Professor Enrique Dussel has explained this broadly. Being a borderless country, you can see how they displace around all the planet. They have more than 800 military bases, many in Latin America, 76, including small bases and new raiders that have been installed to control Latin America and the Caribbean. Between both positions, we must be very careful, because we must consider what our Puerto Rican peers said. It's not only military bases. They also have intelligence and counterintelligence that are a military expression and that must be added. So to say that the U.S. power is somehow weakened, you can say that the great weakness was Vietnam, when the patriotic Vietnamese army defeated it. That was also an extraordinary experience for the U.S. Marines and the Pentagon, who learned a lot from that humiliating defeat by the patriotic people of Vietnam. From then, they have reformulated or transforming, repotentiating their bases, and now they have in Germany the largest military operative center to control practically all Europe. Since there, they have organized operations for the Middle East and Africa. In Somalia, they have intervened in plans prepared from that zone. And Saudi Arabia, Qatar exactly, they have the largest military base in the planet. Together, they handle around 200,000 soldiers with a cost that, of course, increases every day. And that, of course, inside the United States, especially the claims of the Democrats that recently won the Chamber of Representatives means a great problem for Donald Trump. How is the operation of this military bases, how are they maintained? There's an interesting book written by a U.S. journalist, Davis, The Nation's Bases. And there he explains how the United States, in an attempt of balancing the huge cost of more than 800 military bases, have chosen different variables. Finally, they have discovered that through contractings and subcontractings, so-called subcontractors of war, linked to the financial military apparatus of the United States, they can minimize this cost in the U.S. Federal Reserve. Inside the United States, the people have claimed through demonstrations that are not always disseminated through the media. Therefore, in Latin America, Colombian bases are maintained through contractors and subcontractors. And of course, and these are aiming against our country. And there is evidence of the criminal and hostile attitude of the United States to understand that the war for them is a business, and therefore they allow these actions. Another question is related to what the United States pretends to create in Latin America. Off cameras, you said that there's an interesting study, I think, by a Puerto Rican journalist. Yes, I received that very early this morning. It has lots of truthness and seriousness and the sources. And that report, written by this Puerto Rican peer, he talks about a triangulation between the United States, Puerto Rico, and Colombia versus the government's office of President Nicolas Maduro. In this triangle, the Colombian U.S. bases and a huge military bases in Puerto Rico are emphasized. The report also says that they will try to defeat and place the power in the hands of followers of the Pentagon, and they will establish a huge supply basis in Puerto Rico to justify to the world that what they did was based on the serious crisis of the people of Venezuela, and send all kinds of supplies with famous humanitarian aid. We have to alert this criminal plan that is being established to the world, all the countries, everybody who's listening to us now, because this is a serious action established by those who oppose the Venezuelan government. Of course, for our country and the Latin American Caribbean, there is a threat that we must put on the table and disseminate through all means. What could happen with Brazil, with the Alcántara bases? Not only that, the plan is made to happen on January 10th. And what will happen on January 1st? The takeover by Bolsonaro in Brazil. They will have Brazil's support that has a huge army and a huge border with Venezuela. And of course, the people of Guyana, Colombia, of course, will add, and the new bases in Aruba and Curacao will be added. Europe is proposing the creation of a unified army. President Trump did not like this and said that they should be concerned for contributing more to NATO. He aspires that they pay 4% of each country's GDP in the return. How would this army endanger United States power? Yes, this position has been made by French President Macron and the First Minister of Germany, who supported him, which, as you say, was rejected by U.S. President, who said that you will see when you're easy food for China, you will call us to defend you, in declarations that were humiliating. Nevertheless, I think that Europe, that lived the First and Second World force have enough experience of how to live without defense. And this is an aspiration that a good part of the European governments have of defending themselves. Perhaps we can understand that NATO, as such, does not represent their defense aspirations. Europe is a group of countries that are distant from the United States but close to other powers, even the Middle East. And it's easy to understand that they are proposing a defense cycle versus eventual war situation. Let's remember that the migration wave that Europe is undergoing at present is a cultivation channel that we don't know how will be spread. And of course, the position of the French president is closely related to the colonialist past that the French had in Algeria and other African countries, and perhaps they're trying to revive this with the declaration and the plan that President Macron just proposed. The G20 is starting today in Argentina, and probably this topic will come out by some of the members. Thank you very much, Professor Roque. We now go to our conclusions.
The borderless portfolio of the United States is broad, and the military is one of the main portfolio at the same level of economic and finances. Military bases are essential knots as well. From one of the opinions, the United States has an addiction to use the military force, and its international relations has been based in military expansion, perpetual war, and insolvency, as Professor Johnson said in his book, 10 Measures to Liquidate U.S. Bases, published in August 4, 2009 in Asia Times. If NATO is being strengthened, it's because they want to preserve that hegemony. We must ask, is the U.S. power falling or transforming versus other powers like the Russian Federation? We must also see what elements could be used as counterweight to limit the scope of this historic intervention agenda. We conclude our critical move today. Thank you very much for being with us.
Follow the most